August 9th, 1945. Nagasaki, Japan. Lieutenant Commander Kermit Behan peered through the bombardier's scope of the B-29 superfortress Bockscar as the clouds finally broke at 28,900 feet. His hands were steady, his voice calm as he transmitted the words that would reshape human history. "I've got it. I can see the target." Below him, 263,000 civilians went about their morning routines in a city that had been spared systematic bombing, many believing their industrial obscurity had saved them. In 43 seconds, 70,000 of them would be dead or dying, their bodies vaporized, crushed, burned, or irradiated by a weapon that released the power of 21,000 tons of TNT from a device weighing 10,800 pounds. This was the second atomic bomb dropped on Japan in 72 hours. The first had destroyed Hiroshima 3 days earlier with even greater devastation. Together, these two weapons would accomplish what 3 years of conventional warfare, millions of casualties, and the destruction of Japan's entire military and industrial infrastructure had failed to achieve. They would force the surrender of an empire that had sworn to fight to the last civilian, that had prepared millions of its people for suicidal resistance, and whose military leadership had rejected every previous surrender demand, despite facing absolute defeat. The mathematics of this transformation were staggering. 6 days separated the Hiroshima bombing on August 6th from Japan's announcement of surrender on August 15th. In those 6 days, 2 atomic weapons killed approximately 200,000 people and shattered the psychological foundation of Japanese resistance more completely than 3 years of conventional bombing that had killed over 300,000 and left 66 major cities in ruins. The strategic calculus that governed warfare for millennia, the belief that national will could sustain resistance against material superiority, collapsed under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. But the story of how these weapons ended the war in 6 days is far more complex than the simple narrative of overwhelming force compelling surrender. It is a story of converging catastrophes, of leadership paralyzed by impossible choices, of a military establishment willing to sacrifice the entire nation rather than accept defeat, and of 2 weapons that provided the psychological escape from a crisis that conventional means could not resolve. The atomic bombs did not simply destroy cities. They destroyed the logic that sustained Japanese resistance and provided the emperor with the rationale to override his military and end a war that was already lost. The roots of this ending lay not in August 1945, but in the strategic miscalculations that had led Japan into war in the first place. December 8th, 1941. Tokyo. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, confided to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo in a conversation recorded by Tojo's secretary. "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have utterly no confidence. The Americans have 10 times our industrial capacity. If the war continues beyond 18 months, we will lose everything." Japanese military planning in 1941 had been based on a catastrophic strategic assumption that a series of rapid victories would secure a defensive perimeter in the Pacific, that American democracy lacked the will to fight a prolonged war, and that Japan could negotiate a favorable peace before American industrial superiority became decisive. By summer 1945, every element of this strategy had proven disastrously wrong. The American response to Pearl Harbor was not negotiation, but total mobilization. Industrial capacity that Japanese planners had understood intellectually, but failed to internalize, transformed into an avalanche of ships, aircraft, and weapons that overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer material superiority. The defensive perimeter collapsed island by island. The Imperial Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective force. The merchant marine was destroyed, cutting Japan off from resources essential for continued resistance. American B-29 bombers reduced Japanese cities to ash with systematic efficiency. By August 1945, Japan's strategic situation was hopeless by any rational calculation. The home islands were under complete blockade. Food supplies were critical with mass starvation projected for winter. Military stocks of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts were exhausted. The Air Force could barely challenge American bombers. The Navy lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Allied forces occupied positions from which invasion of the home islands could be launched at will. The Soviet Union, Japan's last hope for mediated peace, had just declared war and was crushing Japanese forces in Manchuria with overwhelming superiority. Colonel Saburo Hayashi, Deputy Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army, wrote in his diary on August 1, 1945, an entry discovered after Japan's surrender. Our military situation is beyond recovery. We have no fuel for the aircraft, no ammunition for sustained combat, no food reserves to feed the population through winter. American submarines have severed every supply line. Soviet entry into the war will destroy our last field armies in ours. Yet the military leadership speaks only of fighting to the last Japanese. They have prepared plans for national suicide and call it strategy. If the emperor does not intervene, they will sacrifice every man, woman, and child in Japan to avoid the dishonor of surrender. We need a miracle to escape the logic of total annihilation. The miracle would come in the form of 2 atomic bombs that provided the emperor with the rationale to override his generals and end a war the military refused to acknowledge was lost. But to understand how 2 weapons accomplished this in 6 days requires understanding the psychological and political crisis that gripped Japanese leadership since summer 1945. The Japanese decision-making structure in 1945 was paralyzed by an impossible contradiction. Military reality demanded surrender. Military culture made surrender unthinkable. The Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, the body responsible for strategic decisions, was divided between peace faction members who recognized the war was lost and military diehards who insisted resistance could continue indefinitely. The emperor, theoretically supreme, was constrained by centuries of precedent that required military consensus before he could act. This paralysis manifested in Japan's response to the Potsdam Declaration issued by the Allies on July 26, 1945. The declaration demanded unconditional surrender, but implied the emperor could remain if Japan submitted to occupation. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, a peace faction member, initially leaned toward accepting the terms. The military leadership, led by War Minister Korichika Anami and Army Chief of Staff Yoshijiro Umezu, insisted on rejection. The statement that emerged from the Supreme Council on July 28th used the word mokusatsu, which could mean either withhold comment or reject with contempt. International media interpreted it as rejection. American leaders took this as confirmation that only invasion or some extraordinary shock would compel Japanese surrender. The atomic bomb program that would provide this shock had begun in August 1942 under the code name Manhattan Project. The effort consumed $2 billion, employed 130,000 people at secret facilities across America, and represented the most ambitious scientific industrial undertaking in human history. Theoretical physics, industrial engineering, and military necessity converged to create weapons that would redefine the nature of warfare and international relations. Brigadier General Leslie Groves, military director of the Manhattan Project, explained the program's urgency in a 1948 interview. "We believed Germany was developing atomic weapons. If Hitler acquired them first, the war would be lost regardless of conventional military superiority. Later, we learned German efforts were far behind ours, but by then, the project had momentum. Scientists understood they were creating something that transcended military applications. We were opening doorways that could never be closed. Some expressed doubts. Most continued working because stopping seemed impossible once we had started." The successful Trinity test on July 16, 1945, at Alamogordo, New Mexico, demonstrated that atomic weapons were not theoretical, but terrifyingly real. The explosion, equivalent to 22,000 tons of TNT, created a fireball visible 250 miles away and a mushroom cloud that rose 40,000 feet. Scientists who witnessed it understood immediately they had created something that changed everything. J. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of Los Alamos Laboratory, later described his reaction to Trinity. "We knew the world would not be the same. A few people laughed, a few people cried. Most people were silent. I remember the line from the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that, one way or another. The decision to use atomic weapons against Japan was made not through a single deliberate choice, but through a series of assumptions that treated their use as inevitable once they became available. President Harry Truman, who learned of the Manhattan Project only after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, received recommendations from military and scientific advisors that presented atomic weapons as tools to avoid American casualties in the invasion of Japan. The military calculations were stark. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan scheduled for November 1945 and March 1946, projected American casualties between 250,000 and 1 million, depending on the level of Japanese resistance. Japanese casualties would exceed 10 million. These projections were based on the increasingly fanatical resistance American forces encountered as they approached the home islands. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in early 1945 had demonstrated that Japanese forces and civilians would resist with suicidal determination when defending home territory. Secretary of War Henry Stimson prepared a memorandum for Truman on July 2, 1945, that framed the atomic bomb as a means to avoid invasion. Japan has no allies. Her navy is destroyed. Her islands are under complete blockade. Her cities are systematically being destroyed. Yet her military shows no sign of surrender. They are preparing the entire population for suicide resistance. Projections suggest invasion casualties that exceed all previous campaigns combined. The atomic bomb offers a means to shock Japan into surrender without invasion. This may spare hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. The moral calculation, terrible as it is, favors using this weapon to end the war quickly. The selection of targets followed strategic and psychological criteria rather than purely military ones. The Target Committee, composed of military officers and scientists, evaluated cities based on military significance, urban density, and psychological impact. They sought targets that would demonstrate the bomb's destructive power in ways that would compel Japanese leadership to recognize continued resistance was futile. Hiroshima was selected as the primary target for several reasons. It was a major military headquarters and supply depot. It had not been significantly damaged by previous bombing, allowing clear demonstration of atomic weapon effects. Its geography, surrounded by hills, would focus the blast. Its population of 350,000 made it large enough to be strategically significant, but not so massive that the bomb's effects would be diluted across a vast urban area. Captain Robert Lewis, co-pilot of the Enola Gay that dropped the Hiroshima bomb, described the moment in his flight log. August 6th, so 8:15 hours, bomb away, we execute a violent turn to escape the blast. 43 seconds later, the most brilliant flash I've ever seen illuminates our aircraft. We feel two shock waves, the direct blast and the reflection from the ground. When we level out and look back, a mushroom cloud is rising from where a city used to be. Colonel Tibbets asks if anyone has something to say. I write in my log, "My God, what have we done?" The Hiroshima bomb, a uranium weapon nicknamed Little Boy, released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The fireball reached temperatures of several million degrees. Everything within 1 kilometer of ground zero was vaporized or incinerated instantly. Concrete buildings were crushed by overpressure that exceeded 5 pounds per square inch. Fires ignited across 11 square kilometers. Of Hiroshima's population of 350,000 civilians and 43,000 military personnel, approximately 70,000 died instantly. Another 70,000 would die from injuries and radiation exposure within months. Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, director of Hiroshima Communications Hospital, survived 1.5 kilometers from Ground Zero and recorded his experiences in a diary that became one of the most comprehensive accounts of atomic bomb aftermath. His entry for August 6th captured the immediate aftermath. At 8:15, a blinding flash, no sound initially, then a crushing blast that destroyed the hospital. I found myself buried in debris. When I freed myself, the world had changed. Buildings throughout the city were collapsing. Fires were spreading. People with injuries beyond comprehension were wandering in shock. Their skin hung from their bodies in sheets. Their eyes were blinded. They begged for water. We had nothing to give them. The burns were unlike anything I had seen in 20 years of medical practice. They covered entire bodies. The pain was absolute. We could do nothing except watch them die. By evening, thousands of bodies filled the streets. The fires burned so hot we could not approach to help survivors. This was not war. This was the end of the world. The Japanese government's initial response to Hiroshima demonstrated the paralysis that gripped leadership. Military censorship prevented accurate reports from reaching Tokyo for almost 24 hours. When reports did arrive, military leaders dismissed them as exaggerated or attributed the destruction to conventional bombing. The concept of a single bomb destroying an entire city exceeded their frame of reference. They could not accept what their minds could not comprehend. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, the most dovish member of the Supreme Council, recognized immediately that Hiroshima changed everything. He requested an emergency meeting of the Supreme Council to discuss surrender. War Minister Anami blocked the meeting, insisting that one destroyed city did not change Japan's strategic situation. The military leadership was not being irrational in their framework. They had already accepted that Japan would be destroyed by conventional means. One more destroyed city, regardless of the method, did not alter their calculation that honorable death was preferable to dishonorable surrender. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th, just 2 days after Hiroshima, provided a second shock that shattered remaining Japanese strategic hopes. Japan had been attempting to negotiate Soviet mediation of peace terms that would allow them to avoid unconditional surrender. Stalin had encouraged these overtures while preparing to attack. When Soviet forces struck Japanese positions in Manchuria with overwhelming superiority, they destroyed Japan's last field armies in hours. Colonel Takushiro Hattori, operations chief of the Imperial Japanese Army General Staff, wrote after the war about the impact of Soviet entry. We had prepared defenses against American invasion. We had accepted that our cities would be destroyed. We had mobilized the population for suicide resistance. But we had believed the Soviets would remain neutral, giving us time to negotiate terms. When they attacked, they destroyed this last hope. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria, once our finest force, was overwhelmed in the first day. Soviet tanks advanced faster than we could retreat. Their artillery was devastating. In 24 hours, we lost 80,000 men. The Americans were destroying our cities from the air. The Soviets were destroying our armies on the ground. We faced annihilation from 2 directions simultaneously. This was the situation when news of the second atomic bomb arrived. The second atomic bomb, a plutonium weapon nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. The original target was Kokura, but cloud cover forced the aircraft to divert to the secondary target. The bomb detonated at 11:02 a.m. with yield equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT. Geography limited the destruction compared to Hiroshima. Hills and valleys channeled the blast, but the weapon still killed 40,000 people instantly and destroyed 44% of the city. Father Johannes Siemes, a German Jesuit priest teaching at a college 2 kilometers from Ground Zero in Nagasaki, survived and provided testimony that captured the experience of atomic bombing. There was a blinding flash, more brilliant than the sun, immediately a crushing blast that shattered all the windows and tore doors from their hinges. We threw ourselves to the floor. When we emerged, a pillar of fire was rising into the sky from the direction of the city. A mushroom cloud formed above it. The explosion had destroyed everything within sight. Fires were spreading, people were fleeing, their bodies terribly burned. We tried to provide aid, but the injuries were beyond our capacity to treat. The victims begged for water. When we gave it to them, many died immediately. We learned later that water accelerated the effects of radiation poisoning. By nightfall, the city was an inferno. The dead were uncountable. The combination of Hiroshima, Soviet entry, and Nagasaki created a crisis that forced Japanese leadership to confront the reality they had been avoiding. The Supreme Council met on August 9th in a session that continued for hours without resolution. 3 members, Prime Minister Suzuki, Foreign Minister Togo, and Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, argued for immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration with the sole condition that the Emperor's position be preserved. 3 members, War Minister Anami, Army Chief Umezu, and Navy Chief Soemu Toyoda, insisted on additional conditions including no occupation, Japanese self-disarmament, and Japanese prosecution of war criminals. The deadlock was absolute. The peace faction could not override the military hardliners. The military hardliners would not accept terms they considered dishonorable. Japan's governmental structure provided no mechanism to resolve such fundamental disagreement except through imperial intervention that violated centuries of precedent. Prime Minister Suzuki took the unprecedented step of requesting the Emperor personally decide the issue. At midnight on August 9th, the Supreme Council convened in the Emperor's air raid shelter. Hirohito listened to arguments from both sides, then spoke words that would end the war. I've listened carefully to all the arguments opposing Japan's acceptance of the Allied reply. My own thoughts, however, have not changed. I've examined the conditions prevailing in Japan and in the world, and I've concluded that to continue the war means nothing but the annihilation of the Japanese people and a prolongation of the bloodshed and cruelty in the world. I cannot bear to see my innocent people continue to suffer any longer. Hirohito's statement was remarkable for what it revealed about the psychology that made the atomic bombs decisive. He did not claim Japan could no longer fight. The military was correct that resources remained for continued resistance. He did not cite specific military defeats. Japan had suffered worse battlefield losses in previous months. What he cited was the atomic bomb as a new weapon that made continuation of war unbearable. The bombs provided a rationale for surrender that preserved imperial dignity while acknowledging reality. Baron Hiranuma Kichiro, president of the Privy Council and a conservative elder statesman, explained this psychology in post-war testimony. The atomic bombs allowed the emperor to override the military without accusing them of failure. He could claim that a new and terrible weapon had changed the circumstances beyond anyone's control. This preserved the honor of the military while acknowledging we could not continue. Without the bombs, the military would have fought to the last Japanese. They were prepared to sacrifice everything for honor. The atomic weapons provided an honorable exit from an impossible situation. 2 bombs destroyed 2 cities, but they saved Japan from destroying itself. The decision to surrender did not end Japanese military resistance. On August 12th, War Minister Anami and several military officers discussed staging a coup to prevent surrender. Anami ultimately declined to support it, but younger officers attempted the coup anyway on August 14th, seizing the imperial palace and searching for the recording of the emperor's surrender announcement. The coup failed when senior commanders refused to support it. but the attempt demonstrated how close Japan came to continued resistance even after the emperor's decision. War Minister Anami committed ritual suicide on August 15th, hours before the surrender broadcast. His suicide note captured the military leadership's perspective. "I believe firmly in the eternity of our divine land, and I am resolved to die for the sacred land. I hope with all my sincerity that Japan will survive and recover. I respectfully beg His Majesty to protect his subjects and to save them from the disaster which now confronts the land. My death is to atone for my failure." The Emperor's surrender broadcast on August 15, 1945, used deliberately obscure language to cushion the psychological blow. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. The reference to the atomic bomb as the justification for surrender was deliberate. It allowed Japanese military leadership to claim they were defeated by a weapon beyond conventional military response rather than by superior Allied strategy or fighting quality. This narrative, while historically incomplete, provided psychological closure that enabled Japanese society to accept surrender and transition to occupation. The casualties inflicted by the atomic bombs must be understood in context of the broader strategic bombing campaign that preceded them. Between March and August 1945, American B-29 bombers had conducted systematic firebombing of Japanese cities that killed over 300,000 civilians. The Tokyo raid of March 9–10, 1945, killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night through conventional incendiary bombs. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, and dozens of other cities were systematically destroyed through conventional bombing that rendered them as thoroughly devastated as Hiroshima or Nagasaki. General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the strategic bombing campaign, reflected on this in post-war interviews. "We killed more people in Tokyo in one night of conventional bombing than died at Hiroshima. We destroyed more Japanese cities with conventional weapons than the atomic bombs destroyed. Yet none of this compelled surrender. The atomic bombs were strategically significant, not because they killed more people, but because they killed those people instantly with a single weapon. The psychological impact of this was devastating in ways that gradual conventional destruction was not. The Japanese military could rationalize conventional losses as the price of honorable resistance. They could not rationalize instantaneous annihilation of entire cities by weapons they could neither defend against nor retaliate for. The strategic calculations that drove American use of atomic weapons reflected assumptions about invasion costs that recent historical research has questioned. The projection of 250,000 to 1 million American casualties in Operation Downfall was based on worst-case scenarios of fanatical resistance. Some historians argue Japan was already seeking surrender terms through Soviet mediation before the bombs, though evidence suggests these overtures aimed at conditional surrender unacceptable to the Allies. Others contend that Soviet entry into the war was more decisive than the atomic bombs enforcing surrender, pointing to the fact that Japanese leadership feared communist occupation more than American occupation. These debates, while important for historical understanding, should not obscure the perspective of those who made decisions in real time with the information available in summer 1945. American leaders believed Japan would fight to annihilation unless shocked into surrender. Japanese military leaders were planning exactly such resistance. The atomic bombs provided a means to end the war without invasion that American leadership judged would save lives on both sides. Whether this calculation was correct remains debated, but the intention behind it reflected genuine belief that the bombs represented the least terrible option among terrible choices. The human cost of the atomic bombs extended far beyond immediate casualties. Radiation exposure created suffering that continued for decades. Survivors, known as hibakusha, experienced elevated cancer rates, genetic damage, and social discrimination in Japanese society. The lingering effects of radiation poisoning killed tens of thousands in the years following the bombings. Children born to survivors experienced higher rates of birth defects and developmental problems. The psychological trauma of experiencing atomic warfare created a generation haunted by memories that could not be processed or explained in terms that made sense. Akiko Takakura, 20 years old at the time of Hiroshima bombing, survived 300 meters from ground zero and became one of the most eloquent witnesses to atomic warfare. Her testimony, given decades later, captured the incomprehensible nature of the experience. Everything disappeared in an instant. The buildings, the people, the trees, everything turned to ash. I was burned across my entire body. My skin was hanging in strips. I saw children whose eyes had melted from their faces. I saw mothers holding babies that were already dead. I saw men whose organs were protruding from their bodies. These sights were beyond anything humans should witness. For years afterward, I could not speak of it. The memories were too terrible. I thought often of suicide. Only the conviction that I must bear witness to this horror kept me alive. The world must know what atomic weapons do, not in abstract terms or statistics, but in the reality of human suffering. 2 cities were destroyed. 200,000 people were killed. But each of those was a person with a life, a family, dreams and hopes that ended in fire and radiation. That is what atomic warfare means. Complete destruction of everything that makes us human. The strategic legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki transformed international relations and military planning for the remainder of the 20th century. The demonstration that atomic weapons could compel surrender without invasion established their political significance as tools of deterrence more important than their tactical military applications. The Cold War nuclear arms race between the United States and Soviet Union was driven by the belief that atomic weapons had become the ultimate arbiter of international power. The moral questions raised by the use of atomic weapons against Japanese cities have never been satisfactorily resolved. Were the bombings justified as necessary to end the war and save lives that invasion would have cost? Were they unnecessary because Japan was already defeated and seeking surrender? Were they morally acceptable given that conventional bombing had already killed comparable numbers of civilians? Were they fundamentally different from conventional warfare because of their indiscriminate nature and long-term effects? These questions have no universally accepted answers. What can be stated with certainty is that 2 atomic bombs dropped in August 1945 accomplished what 3 years of conventional warfare had not. They compelled Japanese surrender in 6 days. They ended World War II. They ushered in an era where the possibility of nuclear annihilation would shape every strategic calculation made by nations possessing or seeking such weapons. The 6 days between Hiroshima and surrender represented the culmination of cascading catastrophes that overwhelmed Japanese capacity for continued resistance. August 6th, Hiroshima destroyed by atomic bomb. August 8th, Soviet Union declares war and invades Manchuria. August 9th, Nagasaki destroyed by second atomic bomb and Supreme Council deadlocks. August 10th, Emperor decides for surrender. August 15th, surrender announced to Japanese people and the world. These 6 days compressed strategic shocks that individually would have been insufficient, but collectively shattered the logic sustaining Japanese resistance. The mathematics were brutal, but decisive. 2 weapons, 2 destroyed cities, 200,000 immediate casualties, 6 days to surrender. These numbers tell part of the story. The complete story requires understanding that the atomic bombs did not simply kill people at scale. Conventional weapons had already done that. They killed people instantaneously in ways that made continued resistance psychologically untenable. They provided the emperor with rationale to override military opposition to surrender. They demonstrated a level of destructive power that made honorable death through continued resistance meaningless rather than noble. Japanese Admiral Takejiro Onishi, founder of the Kamikaze Special Attack Program and one of the most militant advocates of fighting to the last Japanese, committed suicide after the surrender decision. His final statement captured the psychological transformation the bombs had created. I wish to express my deep appreciation to the souls of the brave special attackers. They fought well and died well for their country. My one regret is that I could not lead them to victory. I apologize to the special attackers and their families for leading them to their deaths without achieving victory. In my death, I wish to atone for my responsibility and to apologize to the spirits of these dead flyers and their families. But I also recognize that continuation of warfare with atomic weapons would result not in honorable death, but in meaningless annihilation. Death in battle serves purpose when it contributes to victory or preserves honor. Death through instantaneous vaporization serves neither purpose. This is why I support the Emperor's decision while taking responsibility through death for my part in failures that led to this conclusion. The strategic revolution atomic weapons represented was not immediately understood even by those who created them. Scientists involved in the Manhattan Project had understood they were creating something unprecedented, but the full implications of nuclear weapons only became clear as the Cold War unfolded. The bombs dropped on Japan were not simply more powerful conventional weapons. They were qualitatively different instruments that made total war unacceptably destructive for any nation possessing them. This realization transformed strategic planning across subsequent decades. The concept of mutually assured destruction, that nuclear war would annihilate both attacker and defender, became the foundation of Cold War stability. The recognition that atomic weapons could not be used without triggering catastrophic retaliation created a strategic stalemate that paradoxically reduced the likelihood of great power conflict while increasing the stakes of any conflict that did occur. The testimony of those who witnessed the effects of atomic warfare firsthand provided moral weight to arguments for nuclear disarmament that continues to resonate. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki dedicated their remaining lives to ensuring the world understood the human cost of nuclear weapons. Their accounts, documented in thousands of testimonies, photographs, and memoirs, created a historical record that transcended abstract strategic calculations. Dr. Shuntaro Hida, a physician who treated atomic bomb casualties in Hiroshima and dedicated his life to documenting radiation effects, summarized the survivors' perspective in testimony given to the United Nations in 1995. I treated thousands of victims in the weeks after the bombing. I watched them die from radiation poisoning, from burns, from injuries that modern medicine could not address. I documented the effects on children, on pregnant women, on elderly, on every demographic group. The suffering was absolute and prolonged. Decades later, survivors still die from cancers caused by radiation exposure. The genetic damage persists across generations. Atomic weapons do not simply kill their targets. They contaminate everything they touch with poison that persists for lifetimes. This is not warfare. This is the end of civilization. These weapons were used twice in human history. They must never be used again. The survival of humanity depends on ensuring that the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain historical rather than becoming prologue to nuclear apocalypse. The question of whether the atomic bombs were necessary to end the war cannot be answered definitively because we cannot know what would have occurred had they not been used. we can state with confidence that Japan surrendered 6 days after Hiroshima, and that Japanese leadership explicitly cited the bombs as justification for surrender. We can state that American planning projected horrific casualties from invasion. We can state that Japanese military planning called for suicide resistance by the entire population. Whether surrender would have occurred without the bombs, whether Soviet entry alone would have been sufficient, whether negotiated settlement could have been reached, all remain counterfactual speculation. What we can assess with historical evidence is that the atomic bombs provided the decisive shock that broke the deadlock within Japanese leadership and enabled surrender. The convergence of Hiroshima, Soviet entry, and Nagasaki created conditions where continued resistance became psychologically impossible to justify even to those most committed to fighting to the last. The emperor could override military opposition using the bombs as rationale. Japanese military leadership could accept surrender without admitting conventional defeat. The bombs served psychological and political functions that conventional military pressure, however overwhelming, had failed to serve. The final assessment must acknowledge the moral complexity that surrounds the use of atomic weapons against Japanese cities. The decision to drop the bombs was not made by monsters, but by leaders who believed they were choosing the least terrible option available. The suffering inflicted on Japanese civilians was horrific, but not more horrific than the suffering conventional warfare had already inflicted or would inflict an invasion. The long-term effects of radiation exposure created unique harms that continue decades later, but must be weighed against the deaths that invasion would have caused across Japan. These calculations are fundamentally incompatible with simple moral judgments. The decision to use atomic weapons saved American lives at the cost of Japanese lives. It ended a war that Japan had started through aggression and conducted through atrocities. It created precedents and technologies that threatened human survival. It demonstrated the destructive potential of scientific knowledge applied to warfare. It accomplished in 6 days what conventional means had failed to accomplish in years. The legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that humanity acquired the capability to destroy itself completely and demonstrated willingness to use that capability when strategic necessity seemed to demand it. The subsequent Cold War arms race created arsenals capable of extinguishing civilization multiple times over. The restraint that prevented their use since 1945 reflects not human virtue, but mutual recognition that nuclear warfare cannot be won by any participant. The 6 days from Hiroshima to surrender represent a watershed in human history. Before August 6, 1945, war between great powers, however destructive, remained survivable. After August 9, 1945, war between nuclear powers became synonymous with potential extinction. The change occurred not through gradual evolution, but through 2 blinding flashes over Japanese cities that killed 200,000 people and compelled surrender of an empire that had sworn never to surrender. The final word belongs to those who witnessed the end of the war these weapons created. Emperor Hirohito's recorded surrender address to the Japanese people on August 15, 1945, remains one of the most significant political statements in modern history. His explanation of why Japan surrendered captured the unique impact of atomic weapons in ways that military statistics could not. Despite the best that has been done by everyone, the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is, indeed, incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. Such being the case, how are we to save the millions of our subjects or to atone ourselves before the hallowed spirits of our imperial ancestors? This is the reason why we have ordered the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. 2 atomic bombs ended World War II in 6 days not simply through their destructive power, but through what that power represented. They demonstrated that continued resistance would result not in honorable death, but in meaningless annihilation. They provided psychological rationale for surrender that conventional defeat could not provide. They shocked Japanese leadership into confronting realities they had been avoiding through ideology and wishful thinking. The cost was 200,000 Japanese lives destroyed in atomic fire and countless more damaged by radiation effects that persist generations later. The benefit, if it can be called that, was ending a war that would otherwise have continued until Japan was destroyed completely through invasion and occupation that would have killed millions more. This calculation is morally irresolvable. It involves weighing certain deaths against hypothetical deaths, immediate suffering against projected suffering, the horror of atomic warfare against the horror of conventional warfare at its most total. History records what happened. 2 bombs were dropped, 2 cities were destroyed. 6 days later, Japan surrendered unconditionally. World War II ended. The atomic age began. Humanity acquired the power to destroy itself and demonstrated that it would use that power when leaders believed circumstances demanded it. The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki bore witness to what atomic warfare meant in human terms, ensuring that abstract strategic calculations would always be haunted by images of shadow-burned walls, vaporized bodies, and generations poisoned by radiation. The question of whether this was necessary or justified remains debated 7 decades later. The fact that it happened, that atomic weapons ended a global war in less than a week, and that the precedent established continues to shape international relations and military planning remains indisputable. 2 atomic bombs accomplished in 6 days what 3 years of the largest conventional military campaign in history had failed to accomplish. They compelled surrender of an empire prepared to fight to national suicide. They ended the deadliest conflict in human history. And they created the possibility that any future great power conflict could end not in victory or defeat, but in mutual annihilation. That makes the casualties of World War II seem modest by comparison. This is the legacy of those 6 days in August 1945, when atomic fire over 2 Japanese cities transformed warfare, international relations, and human understanding of the destructive power we had created. The bombs that ended World War II in 6 days also ensured that any future world war would likely be the last war humanity would ever fight.